So I have a confession to make before I start my talk. It has come to my attention that I was a little loose with my anniversary years on Friday night when I was introducing myself. Typical male thing. I initially said that my wife and I had been married for 25 years, and then I said to the bride and groom, you know, just think 28 years from now you'll look like us. And you know, when I said that, I thought, something doesn't sound right. But we had been married 28, so I was right the second time. Well, I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia, northwest of Philadelphia. And that's about an hour and a half south of Wilkes-Barre, Kingston, where my father grew up. My father's parents were still living there when I was a kid. But being an hour and a half away was a little hard for us to see my grandparents on a regular basis. And I'm the oldest of 6 sons, so as the family became larger and larger, it became even harder for us to visit my grandparents regularly. So I didn't get to know them that well. We loved visiting them. We loved visiting them for a few reasons. One, my grandfather really entertained us. He really played with us at our level. And you know, he would spend what we thought was like hours playing with us while the rest of the adults would hide in the kitchen and have adult conversation. But my grandfather really did entertain us. My grandmother was much more of the disciplinarian, but when we were leaving, she would fill our pockets with finger candy. So of course we loved that aspect of the visit as well. I then was accepted into college in Wilkes-Barre. I was accepted into King's College, and so found myself now living as a college student just about 10 or 15 minutes away from my grandparents. I didn't really think about what that would mean for our relationship when I was accepted. You know, like a typical college acceptee, I was thinking of roommate classes, you know, like life at college, things like that. But my grandfather had been thinking about it because he called the floor phone about the second week I was in school and asked if I wanted to come over on a Saturday to visit. So I thought, oh, that'd be fun, that'd be good to do. So he came and picked me up and drove me back to the house and then handed me the honey-do list. And I began to understand what this relationship was. So, you know, so the next time we did this, which was maybe a few weeks later, I brought my few weeks worth of laundry with me, and it became a very mutual relationship. And I did enjoy going over to visit with my grandparents, and I wasn't obviously thinking about it at the time, but I did get to know them very well over the first 2 years of my college. And today, thinking about them all these years later, today it really is clear to me that they were my role models for how a Christian and hopeful couple lives together in their later years, how they share their love with each other and their hope for their lives together. And so it was a wonderful experience for me to get to know them that intimately. Our visits weren't just day visits like they were at the beginning. They eventually evolved into my grandfather picking me up on Saturday afternoon, and then I'd stay overnight. I'd go to Mass with him on Sunday, and then he'd take me back Sunday afternoon. The first couple times I did it, when I was explaining to my friends that I was giving up a Saturday night at college to spend it with my grandparents, I got some odd looks. But I really did enjoy the time that I spent with my grandparents. And they were they were two very different people. And together they made somewhat of an odd couple. Physically speaking, my grandfather was a robust, 6'2", very healthy man. He was about 80 when I was in college, but he was energetic and he could drive a car around, you know, he could still get around. He was very autonomous, a great sense of humor, bordering on the silly, and he was just a fun man. But my grandmother had been riddled with serious physical disabilities for most of her adult life, but she started off just her physical stature, she claimed to be 5 feet. None of the other adults corroborated that. And we were not very sensitive as kids to her height because we used her as the benchmark to see, when we surpassed the first adult in height. So instead of embracing my grandmother when we would visit, we would spin her around and go back to back. So the height. I'm sure she was very happy to see her 6 grandsons come to visit. But then she developed scoliosis, and so then her back started to, round, and she became even more diminutive. And so, this 6'2", robust-looking man and this frail, round-shouldered, diminutive woman. It was just a very odd, couple together. But then my grandmother also suffered from some other disabilities. She had very painful rheumatoid arthritis. It really made it hard for her to even move around on one level. She used to use a walker even on the living level of the house. And she couldn't sit down into a chair by herself or stand up by herself. She had to have someone help her down and then lift her up. She also was hard of hearing, and of course there weren't aids back then or anything like that, so that would be a problem. Talking with her at times, she wouldn't be able to understand what you were saying. And then lastly, she had Parkinson's disease. And so she would have tremors and stiffness of the joints. And you know that the medication for Parkinson's is dopamine, and a side effect of dopamine is hallucinations. So that was another side effect that she would deal with occasionally. So she really had, painful, debilitating illnesses that pretty much kept her housebound for probably the last 20 years of her life. And so if you looked at this couple at a distance, you might think, here's a couple who is, dreading their later years of life, that their view is becoming narrower and narrower based on their limitations. But that was the farthest from the truth, because as you got to know them, they were a very joyful, passionate couple. They were passionate about ideas. They were passionate about, things that they really liked to be involved in. And over the years, what I've come to realize is that hopeful people have some kind of passion that they can't help but share it with others. They want to share their passion with others. They want to involve others in the things that they really feel strongly about. It could be something very little, or it could be something very large. That part I don't think matters that much. But to have a passion that you really feel strongly about and you want to share with others, I think is key to being a hopeful person as you go through life. And for us as Christians, to have a passion that even connects with our faith, I think really then shows others we would be witnesses to that joyful hopefulness in our lives. And that's really what my grandparents were for me. So I'd like to tell you a few stories about how they dealt with this situation that they were in the latter stage of their life, and how they remained positive and joyful, even though you could see it as being a very limiting and frustrating and even fearful way of living through your later years. So I mentioned to you that my grandmother had some passions that she loved to share. Now, for both my grandparents, their faith was their number one passion. They just really were devout Catholics, but my grandmother couldn't go to Mass or didn't want to go to Mass because of her situation. So the local priest would come into the house to give her communion and to do that once a week for her. But as I mentioned, I would go to Mass with my grandfather when I would stay over, and I enjoyed doing that with him. But two other passions that my grandmother had were politics and baseball. And so this diminutive, hard-of-hearing woman loved watching the Philadelphia Phillies. She was a Wilkes-Barre native, so the Phillies were her home team. She knew every statistic about every player on the team. And I mean, I played baseball. I grew up playing baseball. I thought I knew a little bit about baseball, but I was embarrassed to have conversations with her because she knew so much more about the players than I did. But I still loved watching the game with her. So, you know, especially in the spring when my grandfather would pick me up on a Saturday, I knew what we had in store for us. We'd be watching the Phillies for the afternoon. Now, I mentioned to you that she was hard of hearing. So when we drove into the driveway of the house, I could hear the game from the driveway. So I had to prepare myself mentally for the volume that we would be listening to the game under. And so the three of us would be in the living room watching the game with the volume on full blast, screaming at each other about the play, you know, commenting on the game. And by the end of the game, I was sweating. I was exhausted. I thought I had played in the game. It was so intense. But we would, you know, my grandmother would, you know, yell at the guys or cheer on the guys and then ask us what we thought about the plays. And she just wanted us to be as involved in the game as we could be. Then the other thing was politics. She read the local paper cover to cover, she watched the news all the time, and you know, I was a 17, 18-year-old, and I was just trying to get through school, but I found myself doing homework before I would go over to my grandparents' house, because she would ask me about, you know, what was happening nationally, what was happening locally, and so I felt like I had to be prepared. So it was actually my grandmother who got me to start thinking about, you know, what goes on in our society, in politics. So we used to have wonderful conversations about that as well. So those were the passions that my grandmother just could not contain herself with. She had to share them with other people, and so that it was wonderful having those experiences and conversations with her. My grandfather used a lot of humor in the way he dealt with these limitations that they had as a couple because of my grandmother's illnesses. You can imagine that as frustrated and maybe even as fearful that my grandmother might have been at times because of her illnesses, this robust, healthy man, you know, probably had no idea that he would be the primary caregiver to his wife for this, you know, like 15, 20 years of his life. And as a result of her not being able to leave the house, he pretty much did stay in the house a lot of the time to take care of her, except for running errands or some occasional visits, things like that. So you might think that he would start becoming very frustrated about his lot in life because of their situation as a couple. But he seemed to be very at ease, he was a very patient man, and he really adored my grandmother, and he devoted himself to her and really was her caregiver and he, unfortunately, but I know we all have stories like this, he actually died before she did. But to his death, his primary vocation was caring for his wife, and he did it with such grace and humor. And I just want to tell you a couple stories about how he used humor to deal with the situation. So I mentioned to you that my grandmother was hard of hearing, and I mean, you know, pretty hard of hearing. I'm not exaggerating. The TV would be on full volume when she would watch. But it was a taboo to interrupt the television, especially if the Phillies were on. So sometimes it would be hard to get my grandmother's attention, and so what my grandfather would do, he would stand up and he would stand right in front of the TV. So right away my grandmother's agitated. Then he would cup his hands together and he would yell loudly, "George, George." Her name is Sarah. And she would turn to me deadpan. I will not respond to him. He uses my proper name. And I thought, do you two do this for each other? So they had this little banter about her hearing. And so both of them played her hearing off very humorously. I also mentioned to you that my grandmother, had to use the walker to get around, even just on the living area of the house. But they lived in a Tudor-style house that had, a high staircase. I mean, a high staircase. It must have gone up like 20 steps or so, and it turned to the right at the top. So it wasn't an easy staircase to get up. And the first night that I stayed over, I hadn't thought of this at all, but the very first night, sometime in the early evening when we were sitting there, loudly listening to the TV, I thought, how does my grandmother get upstairs to bed? I mean, I just hadn't thought of it before. And then my grandfather said, well, we're going to go to bed, and I started to feel uncomfortable, because I thought, my grandmother was a proud Irish woman, and so I thought, is she going to be embarrassed that, I don't know how they do this, I'm sitting in the living room, the staircase was to my left, the TV was to my right, so I'm trying to disappear into the couch. And so my grandparents moved to the steps, and sure enough, my grandmother gets down on her hands and knees and starts to crawl up the steps with my grandfather behind her, supporting her. And then about halfway up, as I'm just not sure, if they're embarrassed or not, I hear him start to groan. Oh, I don't think I can do it. Now, this woman may be 80 pounds. And again, she just deadpan. She doesn't even look at me this time, because I'm kind of like, what is going on? On my shoulder, trying to see what's happening. And she just says loudly, he does this even when you're not here. And they just kept going up the steps. All right. So they're upstairs, they're getting in bed. I thought, okay, fine. The embarrassment is over. But it obviously wasn't embarrassing for them. Now, I mentioned to you that my grandmother had Parkinson's as well, and she would take the dopamine medication at dinner time. And I mentioned that the side effect of dopamine can be hallucinations. And if you've ever seen someone having an hallucination, it's not like a dream. They really think that what they observe, visually or hear auditorially, that it's really happening. And so it can be fearful if it's a scary hallucination. So my grandparents go to bed, and as I mentioned, my grandmother would take the medication at dinner, so if she's going to have a hallucination, it's going to be right around bedtime. And she had a very common one that repeated itself. And that was that there was a man under their bed, and he was going to do them harm. And so you would think, my grandfather would lay there and say, don't worry, honey, I'm here to protect you. There's no worries or anything like that. But of course, that's not what he would do. He kept a broom leaning up against the wall on his side of the bed. And when my grandmother started complaining about the man under the bed, he would get out of bed and get on his knees and sweep under the bed with the broom, yelling at this fictitious character. I'm downstairs. I had turned the TV down way low now. And I'm like, what the? And he's yelling at this fictitious character, get out from under the bed. And then he doesn't stop there. He walks around the bed, and he, opens the bedroom door. Now he's yelling in the hall for this man to leave the room. And I'm thinking, I'm going to do battle with someone. Should I call the police? Should I be at the bottom of the steps? I don't know what the heck I should do. And then he follows this fictitious character down the steps. He does not even look at me. He just opens the front door, yells one more time for him to leave the house, and then slams the front door and walks up to bed. And I'm thinking, which one of them is hallucinating? And this is how he would treat, the different issues that they would have together. That he would use this silly kind of humor to cope with this. So I mentioned my grandmother's passions, but my grandfather also had one very important passion to him besides his faith, and that was music. I mentioned to you that he would entertain us as kids for hours, and he would do that by playing the piano and having us dance along and sing along, but he wouldn't play adult type music. He would play music that would entertain us when we were kids. He was a very proficient piano player. He was a blue collar, kind of an Irishman. He always had a job, but he always was in a band too, with some friends of his, and they would play weddings and different engagements and things like that at night. And I even got him to play a couple times for small gatherings at King's College, and people loved him, and he was just, you know, he'd tell stories at the piano, but he was a very good piano player as well. And so this was his passion. He wanted to share music with whoever was willing to participate. And so when he finally retired, he wanted to do something, wanted to volunteer in some way that would just kind of get him out of the house, you know, every day and get him going. And so he volunteered as a crossing guard for the local school. There was a local elementary school in the neighborhood, so most of the kids walked. And so they had adults at different corners to just, you know, usher the kids across the street. And he was a crossing guard right out in front of his house. He'd, you know, get up at 7:15 or so and go out there for about a half an hour or so and just, you know, make sure the kids get across the street. And that would be his little morning way of volunteering for the community. But as you know, all elementary schools have bands. And so, you know, once a week, the kids who were in band would bring their instruments into school. And it was on Wednesday for that school. And I happened to have a Wednesday off one week, so I had come over on Tuesday evening, and he said to me, I'd like you to get up early with me tomorrow to just, you know, see what goes on, you know, when the kids are going to school. And I'm thinking, you know, Brenda, I'm a college student. I have a free morning. I sleep till noon if I can. But I got up because, you know, I wanted to see what was going on. And he didn't tell me anything about it. He just, you know, we had some breakfast, we went out, and kids were coming to school. Now, the first thing was, they were coming about 10 minutes earlier than they usually do. And can you imagine, you know, 4th, 5th, 6th graders actually coming, you know, walking to school 10 minutes earlier than they need to. But they would stop at his corner, and the kids with instruments would take out their instruments. And then the kids who weren't in band, they were the choir. And every Wednesday, and he would have his safety vest on, and then he would start this exaggerated conducting motion, and they would sing and play Happy Birthday every Wednesday. Sing and play Happy Birthday. It did not matter if it was someone's birthday. That's what they played every Wednesday. Now, the other interesting thing was, so I'm standing out there, you know, I'm not sure, should I be laughing? I mean, it's funny, but, you know, because it was ragtag. It wasn't, you know, really well done, but it was kind of funny, it was cute. But then I noticed that parents would be stepping out onto their porches, you know, the few houses around there, and they would be singing Happy Birthday too. And I thought, this is amazing. It's 7:15 in the morning, and this neighborhood here is singing Happy Birthday. And then the song would be over, and the kids would pack up their instruments, and off to school they would go. That was it. No ceremony, just, you know, off to school they would go. Just 10 minutes. This is what he would do every Wednesday, just to kind of inject that sense of joy, that sense of hope into the neighborhood in a very small way. It wasn't dramatic in any way, but it was his way of sharing his music with the people closest to him, his family, his neighbors, you know, things like that. And so that, you know, of course, I experienced all that, but I wasn't processing all that. I wasn't sure what all that meant to me at the time. But over the years, I've realized that that's how hopeful people live their lives. They recognize something that gives them energy in their life, and they transcend whatever limitations they have. And my grandparents obviously had very significant limitations, but they transcended those limitations instead of being trapped in that fear, and they allowed their passions to then infect others and to enliven others. And I think that's how hopeful people live their lives. I just want to share one more example of someone who is a joyful witness of hope for me. And this is a bigger example, so I just want to compare the two. A friend of mine, Lisa Candles, she grew up in Avon, lived in a very comfortable family, a very healthy family. The father was a pediatrician. He had a very successful career, so they didn't want for anything. They kids all went to school, and Lisa went to a good college. She went to Tufts University for graduate school for an MSW. And so she had this very, comfortable, secure life, and Lisa thought that she wanted to give back in some way. So a woman who was a Congregationalist minister decided to start a not-for-profit organization in Hartford called Family Life Education. There had already been an organization that was helping families with infants. It was called Youth Under Severe Stress, or not infants rather, but young kids, young school-age kids. And this minister thought, I want to help the infants. I want to help families with infants. So Family Life Education partnered with Youth Under Severe Stress to start at infancy to like age 12 or 14, whenever Youth Under Severe Stress took over. And they also wanted to see if they could break women out of the cycle of poverty by keeping them in school and trying to reduce the unwanted pregnancy rate. And I mean, this is very, grueling kind of, work, in that there's not a lot of support for it, there's not a lot of recognition for it. But Lisa Candles just quietly started this work. It was a hand-to-mouth kind of organization looking for donations in order to pay its expenses. Sometimes they couldn't have paychecks because of their finances, but she started working there in 1989. She is still there today in Hartford, working at Family Life Education, making a difference in lives of teenage girls, trying to mentor them and motivate them to look beyond the environment that they know, to look beyond their hopes, and to recognize that they could finish high school, that they could go to college. They actually have a relationship with St. Joseph's College in Hartford, where these young women can go to school there if they keep their grades up and meet the requirements, and then be able to be independent and to have careers and to be able to break this cycle of poverty, and then to start families in a healthier way. So day after day, Lisa has been doing this work, not being recognized in any way, not getting the rewards that that we all hope for our fine efforts that we do, whatever jobs we do. But she does it with such enthusiasm and humor. She's just a lively, funny, energetic person, and she just brings that hopeful energy to every person that she meets. And I just happen to connect with the agency through my parish. They get parishes to help in different ways. And she just draws you in. She's just a very infectious person. Her passion influences others in a positive way. And this has been going on for decades. And I think, when I think of someone who's really, that witness of hope and joy, I think of someone like Lisa Candles with the kind of work she's doing. Now, I give you those different examples to try to set up a spectrum of someone who has a passion that's a large kind of a passion, and someone who has passion like my grandparents that might be smaller, to just say to you that somewhere in between that range, we can all find our own passion. It doesn't have to be grand. The point is, it should be something you really love, something that you feel strongly about, that helps you transcend whatever fears or worries or limitations that you have, and you want to share that passion with others. You can't help yourself but share that passion with others. That's how hopeful Christians live. That's how we're called to live as we leave this retreat center this weekend. And I just want to share with you a quote and an analogy. I can't remember the minister's name, but a Protestant minister defined vocations this way. When your greatest joy, and I think you could substitute passion for that, when your greatest passion meets the world's greatest need, that's your vocation. But so you have to find joy in it. It has to be something that fills you up. So it doesn't have to be some large, noble thing. It has to be something you love. And realize that the world needs that. And give it to the world in some way. Some small way, some large way, it doesn't matter. Just give it to the world. An analogy that you probably have heard of this too, it's very popular, but it's the story of a young boy who was walking along the shoreline after a sea surge and had dumped thousands of starfish onto the shoreline. And he's just very slowly, very methodically walking along, picking one up, tossing it in the water, picking another one up, tossing it in the water. And a man comes by and says, "Son, why are you doing this? This is a waste of time. I mean, you're not going to be able to get all these starfish in time. It's not worth it." And the boy just picks another one up, tosses it into the water, and the man says, "Really, son, you should just go play or something, because this is not worth this." He picks another one up and says, "It's worth it to this one." Tosses it into the water. And so we can look at problems in our world, in our society, in our neighborhoods even, and think, this is too big for me. I can't do anything for this. Or we can just get past that limitation and say, I'm just going to take one step. I'm just going to get involved in one way. I'm not going to be outdone by the magnitude of the problem. I'm just going to enter it and see what happens. And so that's what hopeful Christians do. We don't look at the problem and think this is too great for me. We just enter it in some way and see what happens. See what kind of positive influence we can make. One of the lines that we've heard this weekend has really stayed with me this year, and I'd like to just end by saying that line. And that is when we heard, "Don't pray to God for courage. God has already given us the courage that we need. Seize that courage, because your hope can fill the world." And I truly believe that your hope can fill the world. So go out there and share it with others. Thank you.